Wrecks, leaking chemicals so potent they dissolved dive suits, World War II warships still armed with hundreds of live torpedoes, and a lost sailor discovered at his desk perfectly mummified. These are disturbing things recovered from lost ships. Alright, we'll kick this off with something that's an ongoing modern nightmare: toxic chemical leaks. You think deep sea recovery is all about historical treasures? Think again. A lot of recent wrecks, especially from the mid-20th century onward, are packed with industrial cargo like pesticides, petroleum, and other corrosive material. During a project in 2015, divers were investigating a wreck that had been sitting on the seabed for decades, slowly leaking its cargo. The chemicals were so incredibly potent, so highly toxic, that they actually started to corrode the divers' protective gear. We're talking about heavy-duty dive suits and masks designed to withstand the intense pressure of the deep, but even they couldn't stand up to the chemical sludge. Imagine being hundreds of feet down, completely reliant on your equipment, and realizing that the poison spilling out of an old ship is literally dissolving your only protection. What a nightmare. Next up is the problem with military shipwrecks, particularly from World War II. When a warship sinks, it drops a massive arsenal, and a lot of that arsenal is still alive. Divers frequently encounter World War II wrecks that are found exactly as they sank, sometimes with a full stock of torpedoes, explosives, and artillery shells on board. In the Pacific, explorers have documented planes in the hangars of sunken carriers with bombs still secured under their wings. Obviously, the danger here is huge. These things are often unstable because they've been sitting underwater for coming up on 100 years at this point. The metal casings have been corroded in the salt water. One accidental bump from a submarine, a change in water current, or just the natural degradation, and it could cause a massive explosion. This is one of the most infamously eerie discoveries out at sea. If this had happened back in the 1700s, it would have been an old pirate's ghost tale, but this story is from 2060. Fishermen spotted a yacht, the Stiuso, drifting in the Pacific. It looked abandoned, so they went to investigate. What they found was the mummified body of German sailor Manfred Fritz Bogeret, who was found slumped over the chart table in the cabin, still seated at his desk. The dry air, low humidity, and heat inside the yacht had naturally preserved his body almost perfectly. His death wasn't fresh though. Authorities believe he'd been dead for quite some time, maybe years. There are images of his body on the web. YouTube doesn't let us show them, but if you want to go give it a Google, be my guest. Fair warning, it's pretty unnerving. For this point, we go back to the Civil War and the famous ironclad, the USS Monitor, which sank in a storm in 1862. 16 men went down with that ship. In 2002, during a massive salvage operation, archaeologists were able to lift the Monitor's two firearm turret, probably the most recognizable part of the ship, off the seafloor. When they started the careful process of examining and preserving the interior of that turret, they found something they had not been expecting to find: the skeletal remains of two crewmen. The two men had been trapped in the dark, cramped iron compartment when the ship went down. And I mean, sure, it's a shipwreck, people died, but actually finding bones is pretty rare. It doesn't take very long for bodies to disappear completely with all the scavenging creatures down there and just natural erosion, but because these guys were again inside that metal compartment, their bodies were preserved. Being that it had been well over 100 years, finding those remains was pretty powerful. They weren't just names on a list now. They were right there in front of these researchers' eyes. Actual people found in the exact spot they died 140 years before. Next up, let's talk about a famous, deeply sad item from the Titanic: Wallace Hartley's violin. Hartley was the band leader on the Titanic, and the story, which is backed up by survivors, is that he and his band famously continued playing right until the ship's final moments, trying to calm the passengers. Hartley went down with the ship, dying in the freezing water. When his body was recovered a week and a half later, his violin was found strapped to him inside its leather case. It was a gift from his fiancée. It meant a lot to him, obviously, and the fact that this man, facing certain death by freezing, chose to secure his instrument to his body, I mean, that's the stuff famous songs and poems are made of. The violin survived and is now housed at the Titanic Belfast Museum. Another one of the most chilling discoveries in maritime history is the ghost ship Jenny. This story comes from 1840, when a whaling ship called the Hope was working near the Antarctic. They spotted an old schooner completely frozen into an iceberg in the Drake Passage. It was locked, solid, dead in the water. When the crew of the Hope boarded the schooner, it was a complete horror show. Every single crew member was dead, frozen in time exactly where they were when they died. The most horrifying sight was the captain. He was found sitting at his desk, pen in hand, perfectly preserved by the cold, and right there on the desk was his logbook. The last entry was dated May 4th, 1823, a full 17 years earlier. The log read, May 4th, 1823, no food for 71 days. I am the only one left alive. Now, this is tragic, but terrifying way to go out. That man was alone on a frozen boat for 71 days at the very least. I mean, they were probably trapped before they ran out of food, and all he could do is watch as his men slowly starved, froze, and died. And that brutal cold ended up preserving the scene of their death for almost 2 decades. Sometimes the most unsettling things found on the seafloor aren't the big items, it's the small stuff, personal items that remind you of the real lives that were on board. The wreckage of the Titanic is the most infamous, but there are plenty of other ships where the victims were flung into the open ocean. Over time, bodies decompose, wood gets eaten by marine life, but leather often survives for decades. So what you end up finding on the debris field are pairs of shoes. Men's work boots, small children's shoes, women's heels. Sometimes they're still paired up, sitting side by side in the mud, exactly where they fell off the feet of the person who was wearing them. Each pair kind of marking the spot where someone died. Then you have items like a leather purse recovered from the Titanic wreck area. Imagine finding that and opening it. Inside you find a few coins, maybe a photograph, a pair of glasses, a comb they would have used day to day. Some of the last, most intimate possessions someone carried, now sitting at the bottom of the dark ocean. This next one comes from the wreck of the Sydney Cove, a merchant ship that sank near Tasmania in 1797. When archaeologists excavated the wreck decades ago, they found sealed glass bottles from the cargo hold. The bottles had been underwater for over 200 years, and they still contained liquid. Beer, one of my favorite kinds of liquid. The incredible part is what was inside the beer. Scientists were able to extract the original yeast cells that were used to ferment the drink, and because of the constant cold and dark, the yeast was in a state of deep, undisturbed preservation. It was still alive, so to speak. And then they took that 200-year-old yeast, the actual single-celled organisms from the late 1700s, and were actually able to successfully brew new beer. That is crazy. You can essentially hold and use a living organism that was active on a ship centuries before. Disturbing context is everything on this next item. The discovery of whaling tools, specifically harpoons, blubber hooks, and lances, recovered from the wreck of the Two Brothers, which sank in 1823. The captain of this ship was George Pollard. Pollard was also the captain of the whaler Essex, the ship rammed by a giant sperm whale a few years earlier. If you know the story of the Essex, you know the survivors spent months adrift and were eventually forced to turn to eating each other. So when people recovered the whaling tools from the Two Brothers, well, it wasn't like finding standard gear. These were the types of tools they would have used for the processing of bodies. The bodies of their fellow sailors. Finally, we have the head of a porcelain doll that belonged to Titanic survivor Eva Hart. Eva was a little girl when the ship sank, and she had to leave her doll behind when she rushed into a lifeboat. She survived, she lived well into her 90s, and would often bring up that doll when telling her story. But decades after the disaster in the 70s, during one of the early salvage operations, they actually found that doll, or at least part of it. The doll head was pulled up from 2 miles underwater, right in the middle of the Atlantic. When they recovered it, the porcelain was cracked, the paint was faded, and it was completely covered in barnacles and other sea growth. It looks pretty grotesque now, but experts confirmed it matched the type of German doll that would have been sold in 1912, proving it was hers, or at least very likely hers. Unfortunately, Eva never actually saw the head again before she died in 1996, but at least she knew it had been recovered. All that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.